I invite you back to John's Gospel, chapter 6. John chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles, which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. When Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw a great company coming to him, he said unto Philip, Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth or denarii, 8 months' wages worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a lad here which has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so that the men sat down in number about 5,000. We remember Matthew tells us that this was 5,000 men, not counting all the women and children. So 5,000 men, anywhere from, we can guess how many, 10,000, 15, 20, 25,000 people. We don't know. And Jesus, verse 11, took the loaves. And when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down. And likewise of the fishes, as much as they would. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. And therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into the mountain himself alone. And when even was now come, his disciples went down unto the sea and entered into a ship and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus was not yet come to them. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, between 2.5, 3.5 miles, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near unto the ship, and they were afraid. But he said unto them, It is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land where they went. As we look again to Jesus' miraculous feeding of the thousands, we remember, as Kostenberger put it last week, that generally John wrote to supplement the other Gospels rather than repeat their material. There are a lot of other miracles that show up in the other Gospels that John doesn't mention. But this account John mentions. This account is the one miracle that is mentioned in all 4 of the Gospels. So where John does use material that the other Gospels have already included, he will usually recast it to show the deeper theological significance underlying an event or a teaching. As we mentioned, John's seminal and penetrating theological insight here is that the primary purpose of Jesus' miracles was not the powerful act itself, but the event's function as a signpost to who Jesus is It's not just, wow, look at this amazing thing. It's, look at who Jesus is. And so as John does that, the people's responses then to these startling manifestations of Jesus become a referendum, a revelation of who we think he is. We see that with the crowd here. And it's a referendum on Jesus' claim that he is the Christ, the Son of God. And that's not just true for the crowd that surrounded Jesus that day. That's not only true for his disciples that were there that day, but that is true for each one of us. You know, we live as materialistic people, and I don't mean that in a negative sense in this instance, materialistic in the sense of we are material. We are embodied spirits. We need real things to exist day to day. We're a material people, and we live occupied by material needs. We understand that. The need that this crowd had for food was literal and real, and Jesus recognized that. But Jesus calls us to cast our gaze higher. We need to see his person. We need to submit to his purpose. What is he doing? And this morning I want to focus on, as last week we looked at Jesus' miracle in particular and spent time there and looked at the response of the crowd that said, hey, here's somebody who can give us the life we want. Well, today I'd like us to focus our attention on Jesus' interaction with the 12 in particular. And as he meets the need of the crowd, we're going to see that there's a need he calls you and me to meet as well. Could I consider, it's my mind, I hear the old song, little is much when God is in it. We see that here in this chapter today. Consider little is much. As we read these first 15 verses and we think again of the feeding of the thousands, we see, and I want us to see today, that Christ calls us to meet the need of the world. Jesus has called us to meet the need of this world. Now, John shows us the need by the Sea of Galilee. There's a physical need for these people. We talked about last week that Jesus recognized a deeper spiritual need for them as well. But there's a physical need. And John mentions that this crowd, they follow, they observe, they perform, that Jesus was performing miracles. And those verbs that he uses are constructed in such a way to say that this is what continued to happen. The people kept following Jesus. They continually observed the signs that he habitually performed. There were crowds there to see when Jesus had healed that lame man on the Sabbath back in chapter 5. They were also present at various festivals in Jerusalem. Later on, John will tell us that there are people there who see the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead. But generally here, John portrays these crowds as following Jesus only externally. They're drawn to Jesus primarily on account of his miracles. And they're mired in confusion and ignorance. But Jesus sees this crowd. And his question calls for action on this need. He looks up and he sees the crowd. He lifts up his eyes and sees the crowd coming. And he says to Philip, Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all these people? And we remember that John tells us that Jesus asked that question to test Philip. Jesus already knows what he's going to do. He's not at a loss. He's not worried. He's not wringing his hands. He's not phoning a friend. He's already got the answer. Now, from the other Gospels, it seems that there was some discussion. The disciples saw the need as well as Jesus did, and they approach him, and their response we see from the other Gospels is, Lord, the most merciful thing we can do is to send the crowd away. Let them fend for themselves and find their own way. Let them go out into the towns and villages around and see what they can find. That's the most merciful thing we could do here, because we've got nothing. There was some discussion on what to do. And they discussed, could we buy bread? Do we have money? Can we do that? That's the discussion going on. But John frames this in such a way as to highlight Jesus' control and the fact that Jesus is actively testing his disciples. And his question actually pinpoints the size of the need and the insufficiency of their resources. Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all these people? And his mind starts going. Calculator starts running. And his response, Lord, if we had 8 months' worth of salary, which we don't, and could buy that much bread, which we can't, even that wouldn't satisfy everybody. Everybody get a little bit, and that's it. So Jesus asks the question, and in asking the question, it highlights the need. Jesus already knows what he's planned. And his plan, by the way, would not necessarily require any resource. What if the boy hadn't had the barley loaves and the fish? Wouldn't matter. Wouldn't matter. Jesus doesn't need our resources in order to do what he wants to do, what he needs to do, but he's already got this plan. Jesus' question calls for action on the need, and it highlights that need. And then Philip's answer shows us further the impossibility of the need. It's much easier to see the need now than to see how Jesus might provide. And again, so many times I look at the disciples, and sometimes preachers will kind of get onto the disciples or laugh at the disciples or make fun of the disciples. I don't. Because I see me. I see my responses. I see the tendency of my heart to see what's there and forget. One writer said a correct answer in keeping with a faithful response earlier in the gospel. I mean, Philip was the one that said, hey, this is the one. We found the one that Moses talked about. Philip is the one that said that earlier. So a more correct response might be something like, well, Lord, you know. Philip, where are we going to buy bread? I don't know, Lord, but I'll bet you do. What you going to do? Or perhaps even more could be expected. Jesus' question echoes, as we said, that of Moses in the wilderness. And if Philip caught that allusion and remembered, Jesus has turned water into wine, he might have been able to say, Lord, you're able to provide. But he doesn't grasp the full significance of his earlier confession that Jesus is the one Moses wrote about in the law and about which the prophets also wrote back in John chapter 1 and verse 45. And Whitaker says this, thus the test is ultimately concerned with recognizing Jesus' identity and the graciousness of God. In fact, even in this test itself, Jesus' identity and God's graciousness are evident. Jesus is acting like God. For in testing Philip, Jesus is treating him like God treats his own people in the Old Testament. Indeed, in the Old Testament, I love this observation, God tests only his own people, not those outside the covenant relationship. The only individuals God is said to test are the godly, not the ungodly. What God is looking for is faith. Trust that God will be loyal to his covenant obligations to care for his people. This question is meant to reveal Jesus as the presence of that gracious God who is providing the ultimate blessing. He wants us to look at Jesus. So Philip's answer shows the impossibility of the need, and Andrew's response with the lad highlights the insignificance of their resources. What do you have? Well, I got 5 barley loaves. I got some biscuits and a couple pickled fish here for 20,000 people. Might as well have some pocket lint. I mean, what difference is it? I love Andrew's question. What are they among so many? Sometimes I'm accused of being negative, and sometimes I am. But sometimes I just like to say, I'm not being negative. I'm just being realistic. What was Andrew doing? Was he being negative? He's just being realistic. Hey, I got 5 biscuits and 2 fish. But I got 20,000 people. What is this? What are they among so many? The resources are completely insufficient. John shows us a need by the Sea of Galilee. They need bread. But I'm wondering, would you let the Spirit show you the need in Silver Lake? Will you acknowledge the need? As one said, it's significant to note that Christ faces the crowd and makes his disciples face them also. We regularly struggle against that, he writes. He quotes J.H. Bavinck, touches something deep in most of our hearts when he writes, people wish to remain quiet in the peaceful little church under the high Gothic arches. They would brood about God and be preoccupied with the needs of their own souls. They do not want to be shocked by the bewildering idea that there are still many hundreds of millions of people who have never heard the gospel. And today I would ask us, let's not even think about the hundreds of millions of people around the world who haven't heard the gospel. What about the 2,400 within the boundaries of what was Silver Lake? What about the 14,000 of the village of Salem Lakes? And I understand, and thankfully, we are not the whole church. I'm thankful for that. There are other churches, and Jesus is building his church, and we are not the only believers here, and thankfully we are not the only gospel witness anywhere in this area. I'm thankful for that. The gospel is being preached elsewhere in our area today too. Praise the Lord for that. But why are we here? Is there not a need here? Does God not have you where he has you? Will you lift up your eyes and see the need? He continues, Jesus will not let us brood. He challenges us with the need. Faced with the need, Jesus still asks us individually and also asks our church community, where will we buy bread for all these people to eat? There's a need there. Do you see it? Will you acknowledge it? Will you remember that as good as our friends are, as decent and upstanding as many of the people you know are, without Jesus there is no life? What do we read from John chapter 3 where Jesus said in verse 18, whoever believes on the Son, believes in Jesus, is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, the verdict, the finding. Light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. We live in a village of people who are seeking to live their lives as well as they know and make their lives work apart from God. There are people around us, there are people around this building right now who need Jesus, who need to know him. And the truth is, we are the messengers of that life. Paul asked the question in Romans, how are they going to believe unless somebody tells them? Paul told the believers in Corinth, listen, God has committed, God is in the world. God is in the world in the business right now of reconciling souls to himself. That's what God is about right now. And he has committed to us the ministry of reconciliation. He's given that to us. This is our commission. You go and make disciples. That is our commission. So I appreciated what that writer said. We do want to gather in our church building. And I'm thankful that we have a nice place to gather. We don't gather under the high Gothic arches, but we gather under our beautiful 1950s era flying buttresses. Reminds me of the church I was in when I was a kid, and I love it. And it's beautiful. And I'm thankful for it. But have we forgotten that the gathering in here is not why we're here? We gather here to prepare to go out there. John shows us the need on the Sea of Galilee. Will you let the Spirit show you the need here in Silver Lake? Because there is one. But along with that, will you acknowledge our insufficiency? Will you acknowledge that? Allow me an extended quote here. I love when people just put thoughts into words better than me. So faced with the need, Jesus still asks us individually, where are we going to, and as a church community, where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat? This is a test of Philip, nor is it accidental. Jesus regularly tests his people. We cannot simply amble along with Jesus because he's concerned more for our growth than for our comfort. To walk with Jesus means climbing. He continues. Sadly, our response to the Lord's testing is too often the same as Philip's. I'm reading this because it speaks to me. Maybe this will speak to you as well. We measure the need, we quantify our inadequate resources, and we resign in hopelessness. It's all beyond us. The need cannot be met. And even when, like Andrew identifies some limited resource, the possibilities are not significantly improved. How far will they go among so many? Verse 9. But this assembling of our resources is a key to the divine provision because Jesus is not discouraged as we are by what we have to offer. Indeed, if we will put it into his hands, he will still give thanks for it. A wonder in itself. See, our instinct is to put ourselves down, demean what we have to give, particularly when we measure it against raw human need. But Christ is thankful for us. If we will believe sufficiently in his gifting to trust him with our whole selves, he will take us, break us as need be, and offer us to the Father as in his hands the miracle is repeated, the resource multiplied, and a multitude fed. The key beyond our believing in God's ability and will to use us lies in the wholeheartedness of our surrender to him. What God's looking for is faith. Trust that he will be faithful. I love what Pastor Tim said. We need to allow Jesus to break the bread of our obedience. Putting ourselves into Jesus' hands, putting our obedience into his hands allows us to see that he doesn't need any outside material, but he's pleased to use what we give him. Do you understand that? Jesus doesn't need me. He can do what he wants, but he wants to use me. Think of that. He can do his work just fine without me, but he doesn't want to. He wants to use me. He wants to use you. You know, I remember when I was in high school, the 1 year that I was on the football team, to say that I played football would be a little generous. But I was on the football team and late in the season busted my knee and was standing on the sideline on a knee brace the rest of the year. And we didn't have a good team, but our last game of the season we did actually win a game, which was exciting. And at the close of the game, as the team is gathered there on the goal line and they're celebrating, I was on the sidelines just kind of gathering equipment up because, you know, that's what I was doing, injured, kind of acting as a manager kind of thing. So I was just gathering stuff up. And the coach was getting ready to head over there with the other guys to celebrate, and he said to me, he said, "You coming?" And I hesitated. He said, "Well, you're part of this team, aren't you?" So I went over there. But why did I hesitate? I didn't feel like part of the team. I didn't feel like I'd really contributed. I didn't really feel like that was mine to celebrate because I was over here on the sideline. I wasn't out there on the field. I don't know what the Lord wants to do But I ask you again, what position are you playing in what God is doing at Community? What position do you play as God works through Community Baptist Church? My position on the football team after I busted my knee was left out. Some of you get that in a second. You know, it's left side, right side, left out. That's what I play. I was out. I know it's still early. I get it. But I want you to know, God doesn't want to sideline any of us. But He will let you sideline yourself. How many of you have and do? Do you want to be part of what God will do, what God is doing? Let's gather. Let's assess our resources. Let's organize for obedience. Let's give what we have for His use. Let's place all of our life and all of our church into His hands. But Pastor, I don't have enough to offer. Neither do I. Every day, I stare into the gaping maw of need that I cannot meet. I am not sufficient. So what do? The next right thing. Show up. Say something. Give something. Do what I can. With a resigned hopelessness? No. With an eternally renewing hope that if I will put this in Jesus' hand, He may do something with it. For you and for me, as then, so today. The provision is not you. The provision is not stuff. The provision is not things. The provision is Jesus. And that's what Jesus gets onto this crowd for the next day. You're not following me for me. You're following me because of stuff I give you. I wonder, is it possible that people in churches get discouraged because you're not actually after Jesus for Jesus? You're after Jesus as long as He will get you what you want. You're connected to His church as long as He will get you what you think you want. But no, Jesus doesn't just provide. Jesus is the provision. And Christ calls us to meet the need of this world, and He is the need of this world. If we don't recognize that, the world's not going to recognize that. Will you see the need? Will you let the Lord show us the need today? What an amazing experience that must have been. To be those 20,000 hungry people. To have Philip stand there, if we had 8 months worth of salary, worth of bread, we just can't do this. To have Andrew say, hey, got 5 biscuits and a couple fish. And Jesus says, have everybody sit down. And then Jesus takes that meager amount. I just cannot, in my mind, I cannot overestimate the ridiculousness. How ridiculous must that have looked? You could hold all that in 2 hands, and He holds it up in front of 20,000 hungry people. We'd use one of our colloquial prayers. Oh Lord, for this bounty we are about to receive. May we be truly thankful. But then He starts to break it. And just keeps breaking it. And as the bewilderment turns to amazement, that had to turn to absolute exaltation. That had to be the best party you've ever been to. How exciting must that have been? And in particular, for those disciples who give out everything they were just handed and then run back and there's plenty more and they go give that out too. Wow. And as is true in life, so is true for them. As one said, from the mountaintop of participating in the feeding of the multitudes, the disciples descend to the valley of experiencing a violent storm as they try to cross the Sea of Galilee. The other writers spend a lot more time here and focus on the event itself. Matthew points out for us the event of Peter walking on the water. That's when this occurred. Mark at least outlines the storm and Jesus walking out and calming the waves and spends a lot more time here. John's very pointed, very terse. Not a lot of detail here, but I think that's in fitting with the broader picture of what he's doing. See, Christ calls us to meet the need of this world, and I think as we look at the response of these disciples in this boat, I would say that we need to call on Christ to magnify his name in our church. Christ calls us to meet the need of this world. Let's call on Christ to magnify his name in our church. The disciples in this building resemble the disciples in that boat, I think. We cannot obey by our own power. Jesus gave them a very simple instruction. And remember, some of these guys are fishermen. One of them may have owned this boat. These men know how to row across the lake. Jesus gave them a very simple instruction. Get in the boat and go back across. Simple. And they couldn't do it. The wind and the waves were contrary. They couldn't do it. And for you and for me, we cannot obey in our own power either. One writer said this, before the miracle of the loaves is discussed, there's a further sign here that takes place, which also appears following the feeding miracle in the other synoptic gospels. The disciples are alone in the boat, in the darkness, when a storm blows up, as was frequently the case on the Sea of Galilee. There's a mood of discouragement, underlined by John's observation. It was dark. Listen to what he says here. Here, this picture, here is discipleship without the discerned presence of the Lord. And recalling the traditional image of the church as a boat, it's not difficult to make application. There's a picture something here. And again, let me be careful in saying, I'm not saying as you read this, a boat represents the church. They were in a boat, a real boat, okay? But we're finding a similarity. This gathering of disciples gathered together to do something Jesus had told them to do. He says this, particularly in the West, it would be difficult to find a more telling picture of the church. Here is a small handful of people, seemingly remote from the land where most people live their lives, apparently irrelevant to the great issues confronting the world. It is tossed by the winds of secularism without and controversy and uncertainty within. Out of touch with its point of departure, unsure of its whereabouts, and with no clear destination ahead, all while its members, like the disciples in the story, strain at the oars of good works and ministry, making no apparent headway in the process. And crucially, they have no manifest conviction that Jesus, the head and Lord of the church, is anywhere in sight. It's dark. Does that resonate with anybody else like it does me? That hits me. Maybe you don't, but that's how I feel most of the time. How about you? See, maybe some of you still aren't even thinking about the need enough to be thinking this way or recognize this. But this is where we are as well. I think the disciples in this building are like the disciples in that boat. We're trying to do what Jesus said, but we're not making any headway. Don't seem to matter. Don't seem to make any progress. Not even sure if Jesus is on the boat. Feels that way. See, like them, we can't obey in our own power. We can't do what we're supposed to do in ourselves, in our own strength. We need more. We need something else. We cannot obey. We cannot stand firm without a faith in the person of Jesus Christ. John is very terse here. There's not a lot of details here, but I think that the way he narrows this focus points us to this statement of Jesus. They see Jesus coming and they're afraid. Why are they afraid? Because people don't walk on the water. Mark tells us they think maybe it's a ghost. We don't know. But they see Jesus coming, they're afraid. I like what somebody pointed out. Sometimes Jesus showing up actually makes things worse in the short term. We've seen that happen. How did Paul's life go once he gave himself to Jesus? Oh, it was all sunshine and roses from that point, right? He's stoned and left for dead. Sometimes Jesus showing up doesn't make things calmer right away. But they are afraid. And what does Jesus say? He calls out to them, "It is I. Stop being afraid." The phrase here, ego eimi, I won't take the time to lay it all out, but there's so much here that resembles the other appearances of God in the Old Testament where God shows up in front of people, announces his presence, and they're afraid at his presence. But he gives them his name and tells them not to be afraid. And the phrase that Jesus uses here, it is on the one hand the common way that you would say, "Hey, it's me," in Greek. It's ego eimi, I am. It is I. That's the reasonable translation. But we know as we read John that there are always echoes of God's initial response to Moses. "Who will I say sent me? I am." Jesus later on will say, "Before Abraham was, I am." Listen, we can't stand firm without faith in Jesus the Christ. Not a Jesus of culture, but the Jesus who is Christ, who is God himself. We need to see him. We need to magnify him. We need to trust him. The disciples in this building resemble the disciples in that boat. We can't obey without the presence of Jesus. We can't stand firm without faith in Jesus the Christ. They needed Jesus to get in the boat. We need Jesus to guide this body. Jesus is the King over chaos. See, throughout Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, the water, the waves, the sea was a picture of chaos. And that which was beyond control, but Jesus masters this. As one writer said, Jesus appears here as Lord of the waves and the seas. The personal manifestation of the Almighty who walked upon the waters at the Red Sea. A similar passage in Psalm 107 concludes, "He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven." Note that John says here in verse 20, "But he says to them, 'It is I, don't be afraid.' Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land where they went." Some will try to say, well, once Jesus got in the boat and things calmed down, it just seemed like no time at all and they were at the shore. No, the emphasis that John has is on the boat, not the disciples' perception. I think there's another miracle here. Jesus gets in the boat. He's not going to sit there and row with them after that. He just gets them. The test has been provided. The test is done. The teaching is done. We're where we need to be now. He just moves them right there. He's the king over chaos. This arrival, one writer said, is apparently a further miracle because immediately on Jesus entering the boat, they find themselves at their destination. The appropriateness is well caught by Godet, who said, "One can scarcely imagine, indeed, that after an act of power so magnificent and so kingly as Jesus walking on the waters, he should have seated himself in the boat, and the voyage had been laboriously continued by the stroke of the oar." At the moment Jesus set foot on the boat, he communicated to it the force victorious over gravity and space, which had just been so strikingly displayed in his own person. This is a chaotic world, but Jesus is not worried. He's a king over it. He's still in control over this thing. So he continues, Christ's presence brings renewed hope and power to his dispirited church, and where needed, to individual lives. The last word does not lie with the world. No matter how threatening its manifestations, Jesus still comes walking upon the waves, and in a recovered experience of his presence, his church, for all its internal failings, may yet sweep upon its way and at the last be carried by its triumphant Lord onto that eternal shore for which we are destined. He is the king over chaos. He is kind to his children. Jesus comes to them, verse 19. And Mark reminds us, if you go back to that passage where Mark talks about this, we remember that they've never been out of his sight, even if he was out of theirs. Mark tells us that he saw them while he was up in the mountain praying. He saw them toiling in rowing. He never lost sight of them. He knows where they were. He had his eyes on them. They weren't alone, even if they couldn't see him right then. His commitment is unconditional. Whatever its limitations, his church will not be abandoned. He stills the disciples' fear with his word of greeting. It's I. Stop being afraid. Two things surface in this portion of our text. As Gangel summarizes, first we see that Jesus Christ was all sufficient for any need, even when his disciples were in confusion. And second, the purpose for this miracle seems clear. He's going to instruct his disciples. He's going to lay a foundation for the Sermon on the Bread of Life. He's going to feed these hungry people. This miracle reveals Jesus' authority to the disciples and his purpose of ministry to the crowds, the requirement for help in their distress. The requirements for help in their distress were simple enough. We're in distress, we need help. What do? Recognize their own need and take Jesus into the boat. That's what they did. This has not changed much in our day. Just as seeing Jesus and recognizing him were not enough, they had to take him into the boat. And as we will see in our continuing study of chapter 6 here, just intellectually agreeing with Jesus has to be accompanied by actually appropriating Jesus, believing on him, and personally committing yourself to him in order to receive the eternal life that he offers. You know, back in Mark's gospel, we read about another boat trip in a storm, and that time Jesus was already in the boat. And in the midst of his disciples' desperation and fear, Jesus stood and calmed the waves. And when we preached on that passage a while back, I noted then that the point of the miracle was not to say that Jesus will always calm the storms of your life. That's what we want to do. You know, Jesus will calm the storms of your life. He can. He doesn't always, does he? And that wasn't the point of the miracle. The point was that we needed to recognize Jesus as the true and gracious God who is worthy of our trust and present with us in the midst of that storm and even in control over the storm. The point is to trust him. He's never out of control, and you are never beyond the reach of his grace. And I want to make a similar observation here. There's a need to be met, and we are called to meet that need. And I want to believe that as we will obey to the best of our ability, that Jesus is going to come in and do some amazing and wonderful things. I want to believe that. The point of this miracle, however, is not to tell us that every time we have a physical or material need, Jesus is going to sweep in miraculously and meet it and give us more left over. That's not the point. He can do that. He did that here. But what did he say to the crowds the next day? You're not here for me. You're just here for the food. See, we can do our best to meet those temporary and temporal needs, but those keep going, don't they? In fact, the same crowd that had just been fed, many of them come back, and when they realize what Jesus is claiming to be, they demand another sign as proof. Well, wait a minute. There's no end to it. So the promise for us here is not, listen, if we will obey, Jesus is going to do miraculous and amazing things, and we'll all be amazed and see his great provision. And for a context of our church, he's going to sweep in and build the church, and our church is going to grow, and we'll reach more and more people. I want that to be true. And he's able to do that. But the point is not that we are always to expect miraculous provision of our every physical need. Rather, we are to see Jesus as the true provision. We're to see Jesus as the one in whom we trust. He will get us where he needs to, no matter what that may look like to us. See, we don't know what he could do, how he might bless, if we would put all of our lives and all of our church into his hands. I don't know, we're not told, but the fact that when they were ready to gather up the fragments that remained, there were 12 other food baskets available. I don't know that Jesus and the disciples were just carrying around empty food baskets. Maybe they had been. Maybe they had had food in one time and still had. I don't know. But some would say that might indicate that there were others who had brought food as well. There was some other food out there, but when it came time to do the search, all they got was 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's a possibility. We don't know. We know that's what Jesus used because that's what was in his hands. I wonder if we've still got some empty food baskets sitting out here somewhere. I wonder if we've still got maybe a couple biscuits and maybe a pickled fish or 2 sitting out here. I wonder if as we look out over our congregation, I wonder if we are still holding on to some of our meager resources. Convinced either that they are too insignificant to bother with, or that somehow if I give them up, I will be at a loss. They will do more in the hands of Jesus than they will in yours. We need Jesus. Silver Lake needs Jesus, and we are called to provide. But to know the provision of Jesus, we need the presence of Jesus. Don't miss it. These disciples willingly received him into the boat. We want him here. How many times have we begun services here asking, Jesus, would you be present? We want you here. See, here's the reality. We can't feed our world until Jesus is first. Crowd had their own agenda for Jesus. You may have your own agenda for Jesus. That's not how it works. No, we submit to his. He has to be first. He is the I am. He is the Son of God. He's got to be present. He's got to be here. We can't provide until he's first. We need all of our lives and all of our church in his hands. He needs to be first. Let's pursue that.